Morning, everyone. I think we've already heard, haven't we, that there's going to be considerable debate about the merits of water services aggregation. And I think having been in the regulation space now for 20 years, I think my only conclusion on that is that it depends, and it depends on what you're looking at. So what I'm going to talk about here is what Scotland's experience has been. And talk you through that really quite quickly. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to just talk you very quickly about the stages of aggregation, the factors that in Scotland made it successful, what some bumps in the road have been, what's actually happened, and what a couple of the challenges are. So Scotland's probably fairly typical of most jurisdictions in that we started with a very large number of local service providers. In 1945, there was still over 200. It's for a country of at the time less than 5 million inhabitants. 1968, we had regionalisation. There was a bit of a spurt of investment at that time, soon went away. In 1973, there's a major reform of local government leading to change in 1976. There was then, in 1996, a step towards 3 and ultimately to Scottish Water in 2002. So what were the drivers on this? Well, the English industry was privatised in 1989. The Scottish industry at that time remained in public ownership, largely because it was a local government service. The fact that it avoided privatisation created yet more tension between central government in London and local authorities in Scotland, and led to further local government reform in Scotland and the move to a simpler set of local government arrangements with 32 councils. But after 20 years of aggregation or regional operation, it was going to probably be too difficult, probably too expensive, and probably contrary to any ambition to privatise, to move back to local council control of supplies. So the response was to create 3 entities. That was formalised in the Local Government Scotland Act in 1994, and they took effect in 1996. So that was all quite good, but by 1996, privatisation and very robust economic regulation in England had already started to have a real noticeable impact, and Scotland was not doing very well, to say the least. The response of a new Labour government was to introduce a light touch economic regulator in 1999. That's us. The introduction of regulation introduced 3 things, or revealed 3 things. A, that we needed much more investment. B, that the gap in performance was much greater. And that challenges were going to be unsustainable in the north of Scotland. So what is it that makes a difference with this reform versus the creation of Scottish Water versus the 3 authorities? Well, I think the first thing I'd say is the governance of Scottish Water is properly effective. So we have a competence-based board. We have a management chosen for its expertise. I think the second thing I'd say is that we have a regulation framework that has clear roles defined in law. With each having a clear sense of what it's there to do and being independent within that policy framework. And then the third thing was that the single entity removed the need for acute regional trade-offs, both in service levels and charges, because those were the things that were huge distractions and caused for lots of political frictions and basically forced people to take their eye off the game of improving performance. Personally, I suspect that all of these are equally important. I don't think you can look at aggregation in isolation. I think you have to look at aggregation in the context of governance, in the context of regulation, in the context of levels of investment that are required, in the context of population density and various other things. So turning now to the role of economic regulation, we learned an awful lot from Ofwat. What in particular, the collection of information is really, really important to address information asymmetries that will always exist between a regulated entity and a regulator. And Ofwat's experience showed that a hard budget constraint, comparison league tables, and detailed econometric and unit cost benchmarking were going to be really effective. And this was underpinned by really consistent collection of information over time. And I think that was and has been really important. We've used all of these techniques, I think, probably to fairly good effect in when we look at the results. But it has been really powerful in Scotland to be able to show that a public entity, which was what politicians in Scotland wanted, was doing demonstrably worse than a private entity. That doesn't go down well in Scotland. And telling Scottish policymakers, particularly given they were sitting in a new parliament, devolved for the first time since 1707, that their entity that they owned was doing rather less well than some private entities in England was also quite helpful in terms of getting them on side for the needed reforms. In my view, it's really important that regulators are not placed in a position that they have to make political decisions. It could often seem quite sensible that regulators have duties such as sustainable development or affordability or resilience. But I think if you think about it for more than a few minutes, you'll quickly realize that if you're doing that, you're making trade-offs between different desired outcomes with different incidence effects on different groups of customers or communities. And as soon as you do that, the perceived objectivity of the regulator starts to be undermined, and the options open to a regulated business then to challenge the decisions of the regulator start being opened up. So in the Scottish context, Scottish ministers take all those decisions. And what we do is basically set charges within that frame. What is it that that we could have done better? Well, the first is that we could have done better in harmonising charges. What we did was probably do it with insufficient information when we started. So there were larger incidence effects than we were comfortable with. Frankly, the government was comfortable with, and certainly those who were impacted were comfortable with. We learned a lesson when we did a later work on wholesale tariffs, and we did a very, very detailed piece of analysis, but going into that level of detail was actually really quite effective. The other lesson that I would draw is that we were probably borrowing too much. There's always going to be a strong temptation to use the maximum borrowing that's available. But it's important to remember borrowing is a source of financing. It's not funding. Borrowing has to be paid for. As such, increasing borrowing simply increases the amounts that future generations have to pay versus current generations. So it's important to be using it where what you're doing is transitioning, or what you're doing is smoothing costs over time, and not get sucked into the idea that if I borrow a bit more, then I don't need to put prices up by quite as much. As I said earlier, our attempts at aggregation second time round with Scottish Water has been rather better than first time round. Investment has increased really markedly and is much more efficiently delivered than previously. By our estimate, that's about £6.7 billion worth of efficiency savings. So what's that, about €7.5 billion? About £1,300 for every man, woman, and child in the country. So about what, €1,500 for every person in the country. That's pretty substantial stuff when the average bill's about £400 for a household. Operating costs have fallen very markedly over that period. One of the things I think we got right, probably by accident, is that we had spent to save money. which made it easier to deal with more structural issues and deal with depot closures, redundancies, that sort of thing. But it worked because within 8 years, Scottish Water was matching the performance of the best companies in England. The results, charges on average have gone up by 0.5% less than the rate of inflation per year since the aggregation, despite all that extra investment. Whereas before that, they were going up at annual rates of 12 to 16% in the previous years. Levels of service have also gone up, so it's not a question of cutting corners. This is just a way that we look at measuring service as an index of measures. In the past, it was probably quite easy to look at what we were doing, what increments in service levels, what reductions in costs we were getting. I think as we look forward, we've got bigger challenges. Dealing with climate change, dealing with asset replacement is going to mean very different types of monitoring, but it's going to have to be underpinned by a lot of information. But hopefully the experience that we've had so far places us in a not too bad place in terms of addressing that. So that's a very, very quick canter through. Thanks for that.